So let's go to the next part of this here. All right, so, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so, and God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Well, to understand that, because that doesn't make any sense at all, really. So I think I told you a little bit about this before. So the world that's being created in this particular account is a phenomenological world. There's a disk of land, because if you go out in a field and you look around, you're on a disk of land, so that's pretty obvious. And then there's a dome on top of it. It's more or less held up by the mountains, and rain comes down, so there's water above the dome, because where else would the rain come from? And underneath the ground, there's fresh water. You can drill down and find that. And then around that, there's salt water. And so that's the world. And it's kind of an empirical world, because if you're a child and you just go out in a field and you look at the world, that's sort of what it would be like. And so that's the world that's being created. And so one of the things that is worth thinking about, and this is something Carl Jung was very interested in, is that these old descriptions are half geographical and half empirical, so sort of based on observation, and half psychological. So one of the things Jung was interested in, for example, was astrology, but mostly for a psychological reason, because, there are stars up on the dome, and then when you look at the stars, you can imagine the shapes of the stars, and that helps you orient yourself, because as soon as you can see shapes in the stars, then you can recognize the constellations and you can orient yourself at night. But then the constellations become gods, say, and the gods turn into a drama. And the drama comes from within. It's the projection of imagination. And so when Jung was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology, because he saw the astrological narrative as the projection of the human imagination onto the cosmos. And so when he was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology. And the same thing is the case with these stories, is that the world they describe it's not the natural world like a scientist would describe it, because these people weren't scientists. They didn't have the technology and the tools. It was the way for them it was the world. For us, it's the way they saw the world. And so we're looking at the way they saw the world. And a lot of that psychology, and we share that psychology to a large degree with those people. So in this is psychology. But it's interesting to know what the geographical substrate is, so that you can kind of understand the stories. And I like this picture, because it's great from a psychological perspective. It's a very famous picture. And so basically what you have here is the world as we know it, and there's the dome with the sun and the moon on it and the stars. And then if you look outside what you know, well, then you're out into this cosmic space, right? And those are like the wheels of the planets and the music of the spheres. And that's the ever-present explorer who's gone beyond the domain that he can understand and is peering out into the unknown as such. And it's a psychological picture. It's like, because you do know some things, and then outside of that, there are things you don't know. And when you're feeling brave, you put a foot or two out where you don't understand, because there's frontier everywhere, right? And if you're feeling heroic and you want to do something for the world and you want to expand what you understand, you poke your head through what you know and you take a look at whatever structure is out there. And he's pretty smart, because most of them is still where it's safe. And I would say that's a good thing, because if you jump right out there, well, then maybe you fall off the edge of the earth. And I wouldn't precisely recommend that, especially if you do it accidentally. And to me, this is a recreation of the Taoist yin-yang symbol, with the white paisley here, and that's what you know, and the dark paisley serpents really there. And the right place to be is right on the line between them, because you got one foot where you understand. That gives you security. And then, but it's kind of dull, because, hey, you know everything that's going on there, and that isn't what people are like. They don't want just security. Dostoevsky said that in Notes from the Underground, a great, great book. And, he said, I love this. It was an early criticism of the notion of a political utopia. He said, look, if you gave people everything they wanted, they had nothing to eat but cake, and nothing to do but sit in warm pools and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. That was his lines. That the first thing they would do, well, maybe after the first week, was go kind of half insane and smash everything up, just so that something that they didn't expect would happen, so that they'd have something interesting to do. And it's so right, because the utopian notion that if you just had all the material stuff you wanted, that you'd be, well, what would you be? What would you do? Would you just sit on the couch and watch TV? I mean, you'd be, I don't know what, you'd be cutting yourself just for entertainment in no time flat, and that's the sort of thing that people do. And so we're not adapted for security and utopia. We're adapted for a certain amount of security because, we are vulnerable, but mostly we want to have one foot out where we don't know what the hell is going on, because that's where you're alert and alive and tense and with it. And I believe this, and I believe it actually has something to do with the hemispheric structure of the physiology of your brain, is that because the right hemisphere looks roughly adapted to what you don't know, and the left hemisphere, and this is an oversimplification, but a useful one, is adapted to the world that you do know, and the right place for you to be is halfway between them. Because and you can tell that. That's what's so cool. And this tells you that this is actually reality that's manifesting itself to you. That sense of active engagement you have in the world when things are working well for you, where you should be at the right time. You're alert and on top of things and engaged, and you don't have much of a sense of time, and the sense of the tragedy of life sort of recedes. And that's when you've got one foot where it's secure and one foot out in the unknown, and your brain signals to you that you're in the right place by making what you're doing meaningful. And that sense of meaning is actually a neurophysiological signal that you've got the forces of the cosmos properly balanced in your being at that moment. And that's why it feels so good. And then, well, what else could it possibly be? I mean, our brain is capable of looking beyond our vision. That's what it's for. And that sense of engagement, there's no reason to assume that that's anything but a real signal. And you can reduce it. You could say, well, the problem with being where you know only is that you don't know everything. And that's going to be a problem in the future. And the problem with being where you know nothing is that's just too much, man. You go into panic mode, and because anything can happen there and you can't handle it. So you got to mediate between those two things. You want to be secure enough so that your physiology isn't revving out of control, and you want to be out there in the unknown enough so that you keep updating yourself constantly. And that's the place where information flow is maximized. And you know that because that's where you are when you're having a really interesting conversation with someone, or you're gripped by a book, or you're really into a movie, or maybe something that you do as apart from your work, or maybe even in your work, you're into it. And that's because you are in the right place at the right time, and your whole nervous system is signaling that to you. And I would say that's the sort of place that you should be all the time. Of course, you can't be because no one's perfect, but that's the recreation of paradise on earth. It's something like it, because you are in the right place at the right time when that is happening, subject to certain, what would you say, restrictions that we can talk about later. Well, that's what this guy's doing, and that's, I would say, akin to the action